And good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Happy to be with you. Thank you again for joining me. Pardon me. We're continuing our study of the comparison and the conflation with Joel chapter 2 and 3, Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. And yesterday, we began an examination of the correlation with the book of Revelation. Because I tell you, connecting the dots between Joel 2 and 3, Matthew 25, 31 and following, and by the way, Matthew chapter 13, and the book of Revelation is super, super exciting. Very quickly, let me just, I've just got to do this. I've touched on this previously. Okay, Joel 2 and 3, the time of the harvest. Joel chapter 3, the time of the harvest, the time of the earth would happen in the last days, right? In those days, at that time, I will gather all nations to judgment. That is the, by the way, that is the episynagoge, the fulfillment of Sukkot. Okay, anyway, so in those days and at that time, I will gather all nations to judgment. And the Lord said, at that time, the harvest would take place. To drive home a point that I made a good long while ago, but needs to be reiterated at this point, is this. The time of the harvest was undoubtedly to be in the first century. Now, we've already seen, yesterday, I talked about it. Revelation chapter 14. The Father who knew the day and the hour, according to Jesus, Matthew chapter 24, verse 36, the Father who knew the day and the hour sent his angel. John said, Revelation chapter 14, verse 6, I saw a mighty angel having the everlasting gospel flying through the midst of heaven, saying, having the everlasting gospel to proclaim to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, saying, the hour, Babylon is fallen, Babylon is fallen, Babylon is fallen, for the hour of the judgment has come. The hour. The Father sent that angel to declare the hour has come. Now, I want you to compare this, ladies and gentlemen, with Matthew chapter 13. Okay? And we have more to get to from Joel chapter 3 that we'll get to next week. In Matthew chapter 13, Jesus told his parable about the harvest and about the sowing of the wheat and the enemy sowing the tares. Jesus said the harvest is at the end of the age, in which the Son of Man would send forth his angels, and they shall gather together the elect and gather the wheat into the barn. First of all, they would gather together the wicked and cast them into outer darkness, where there would be weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then when? At the end of the age. Then when? At the coming of the Son of Man. That's Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. Then when? The time of the harvest of Revelation 14. Then shall the righteous shine forth in the kingdom. Well, that's a direct quote from Daniel chapter 12, verse 3. But Daniel 12 is a prophecy of the resurrection, the fulfillment of Sukkot. So in Daniel 12, you have the prophecy of the resurrection. It would be at the time of the resurrection, which is the time of the harvest in Matthew 13, which is the time of the coming of the Son of Man at the gathering of the nations in the last days at the great and terrible day of the Lord of Matthew 25, 31 and following, which is the time of the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven at the time of the harvest of Revelation chapter 14. The time of the harvest at the coming of the Son of Man of Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is the hour. It's the hour known to the Father in Matthew chapter 25, 31, right? Which the angel said the Father was revealing that the time had come. The hour had come. But again, that's the resurrection. The Father, in other words, in Revelation chapter 14, 6 through 15, was revealing the hour of the resurrection, saying the time has come. Well, let me share this with you. In 1 Peter chapter 4, in verse 5, Peter said that Christ was ready, from the Greek word hetoimos, meaning not only morally prepared, but temporally ready to judge the living and the dead. Do you catch that? Verse 7, the end of all things has drawn near. Verse 17, the time, literally, the appointed time for the judgment has come. The judgment. Well, he uses what is known as the anaphoric article. Well, that's kind of a fancy term, isn't it? What is the anaphoric article? Well, according to Daniel Wallace in his Beyond the Basics Greek Grammar, he says that the anaphoric article is by far the preponderant use of the definite article in the Greek. So what does it mean? The anaphoric article is used when a writer or a speaker has introduced a subject. Doesn't matter what the subject is. But then later, in referring back to that subject, he uses the definite article, anaphoric, to refer back to his previous mention. Now, what does that mean in simple terms? Well, in 1 Peter 4, verse 5, Peter mentions the judgment. The judgment of the living and the dead, i.e., the resurrection. In verse 17, he uses the anaphoric article to refer back to verse 5. Only now, he says, the appointed time for the judgment. What judgment? The judgment of the living and the dead. The judgment. What judgment? The resurrection judgment. The time has come. Folks, that was written 2,000 years ago. And there's no way out of that. I've used this in formal public debates, in countless internet debates. And you know what the response has been? Oh, well, it's always the time for the judgment. No, it's not. I'm sorry. That is argumentum desperatum in the 10th degree. There is no validity to that argument. The time has come. The end of all things has drawn near. That's in the perfect tense, meaning it was once not near, but it has now drawn near, and it's time. And that destroys any and all argument that God can't tell time. And it means, without a shadow of a doubt, now watch this, Daniel chapter 12. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall arise, some to everlasting life, some to everlasting condemnation. Then shall the righteous shine forth in the kingdom. as the stars in the firmament. Jesus said Daniel chapter 12 verse 3 would be fulfilled at the time of the harvest. Well, Daniel chapter 12, in predicting the resurrection and the righteous shining forth as the stars in the firmament, Daniel chapter 12 and verse 6, one angel asked another, when shall these things be? When shall all of these wonders come to pass? Held up his right hand, held up his left hand, swore by him who lives forever and ever, and says it shall be for a time, times and a half time, and when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all, not some, all of these things shall be fulfilled. Now, what does that mean? That means that the harvest of Joel chapter 2 and 3 would be when the power of the holy people was completely shattered. It means that the harvest of Revelation chapter 14 was to be when the power of the holy people was completely shattered. It means that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, which is the resurrection end time harvest, was to be and was when the power of the holy people was completely shattered. I discussed this extensively in my book, Who is This Babylon? Remember, for the rest of this month, June 2022, U.S. orders only, you order the book, Who is This Babylon? You send me a note that says you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll send you free of charge, totally free, no extra shipping, no extra charge, a copy of my book, Can God Tell Time? So go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, and order Who is This Babylon? Be sure to send me a note now to remind me that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook. Okay, thanks so much for joining me for this morning's morning musings. I hope that you can see how Daniel 12, Matthew 13, Matthew 25, 31 and following, Revelation 14 delimit the time for the fulfillment of Matthew chapter 25, 31 to the first century and the fall of Jerusalem. I'll see you tomorrow as we continue our study on why N.T. Wright is wrong on the redemption of creation. I'll see you there.